Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Today we're gonna have another interesting class. It's basically gonna be a refresher of some of the concepts that we have already taken about desertification in the previous weeks, and it's gonna also build our understanding about desertification. So if we just do a quick revision of what we have covered from the beginning of the semester, we already know the definition of the desertification. We know the nature, the causes, and the impact of desertification. Then we studied about how to identify desertification, how to know that this land undergoes a desertification. And here we studied about the indicators. Then we saw the importance of studying even the processes that happens at the small scale, like the micro bores. And we studied these processes in details and we gave many examples about it. Then we even studied how human can impact these processes. And now we're gonna know something else. A lot of you might ask yourself a question that, okay, now I know that to be able to identify that this land undergoing desertification, I have to look at the indicators. But how can I judge that this land undergoes this much of desertification or this much of the land is desertified? And this only can be determined by something called monitoring. So let's understand what is monitoring and how it works. To start, I'll give you an outline of what would be the lecture about. So this lecture would talk about two main points. At the beginning, we will give a brief, or we will go through a brief history about monitoring of desertification and how it developed, and then we would know what is really monitoring means. And then we're gonna study 4 different types of the monitoring and mapping techniques that would help us to identify the degree of desertification in an area. We're gonna know about the field monitoring, remote sensing, expert's opinion, and finally land user perspective. So let's start. The concept of monitoring of desertification goes back to 1970s, where desertification was first identified and discovered in the Sahel area in Africa. At that time, when desertification was first identified and they noticed that it's really a serious problem in Africa, they called for the United Nations Conference on Desertification. And in the conference, they concluded that around 3,970 million hectares of the Sahelian area is undergoing the effect of desertification. And this is really a huge area. It's about 4 times the size of Europe. But if we look critically at that particular time, we would see that the assessment method was lacking actually the national and the global scale. It means that the problem was only identified in Africa, and therefore the other people in the other countries did not know so much about it. And the monitoring and the assessment method was not systematic. It means it was just started without so much experience, without tools and many other things. And therefore, because of this, the area or the assessment technique was criticized by many scientists and people. The criticism of the previous estimate initiated another program by the scientists, basically after a few years, specifically in 1987. And at this time, the United Nations Environment Program initiated another program and another assessment called Global Assessment of Human-Induced Soil Degradation. Well, basically what they did, they redo the estimation of the amount of area that is desertified in the in the Sahelian desert. And this time, the assessment was based on the experts' opinion. So what they do, they ask around 250 soil scientists and environmental scientists from over 21 regions in the world to come to the Sahelian area and redo the estimation. And at this time, the aim was not only to identify the desertified area, but even to come up with the more specific information, like what is the type of desertification that exists there? Is it a vegetation type? Is it because of let's say because of the overgrazing, because of the drought? What exactly the causes of the land degradation over there, and at what rate, and so on and so on and so on. So at the end of the day, they concluded that the previous estimate, which was 3,970 million hectare, was overestimated. It means that the real size of the desertified area is basically about 3 times less than the previous estimated. Even though this estimation was based on expert opinion, it was again criticized. Well, scientists, people, they don't stop criticism. They always have something to say. Why it was criticized? Because of the following reasons. If you go back to the definition of desertification, you will find at the end of the day that when you talk about human causes, it has to consider the 3 sustainability pillars: the socio-economic, the political things, and the environmental factors. So this assessment by the scientist or by the expert was criticized because it did not take in consideration all the 3 aspects that is in the definition. It doesn't take the management goal. It does not involve the local stakeholders. It doesn't involve people. It didn't ask them and so on. And it only provide information about desertification, only about the environmental aspect, and specifically only about the soil. That's why it was criticized. We can see from the previous discussion that to come up with a precise estimate of the extent or the area that undergoes desertification, you would have to consider all the sustainability pillars. Remember that when we talk about the definition of desertification, it's a type of land degradation due to climatic changes and also human impact. And we talk about human impact, we have to consider the 3 sustainability pillars: the socio-economic, the political, the institutional, and the environmental factors. If you did not consider all of these aspects, you would have incomplete and not precise estimate of desertification, like what we said in the previous slides. The second thing that you have to keep in mind, that if you just look at the map here, you would see that this map actually classified the countries of the world based on their vulnerability to desertification. Some of the areas are highly vulnerable. They are more susceptible to desertification. Little changes or little impact can really cause desertification, and some other countries are resistant. But to come up with such a map, and to come up with a map that identified the desertified area, you need basically to look at something that would tell you desertification, or would tell you the desertification, and that is basically the indicators. For example, to tell whether a land is undergoing desertification or not, you can look at their vegetation cover. So by monitoring, by collecting information about the vegetation status, the vegetation density, the changes in the vegetation, and so on, you would need to monitor the vegetation in that area for a long time and collect all of this information, and then you would see whether the vegetation cover is gone, and if it is gone, is it recoverable, like after some time it again recovers, so this won't be desertification, or the vegetation cover is not going back to its original status. And here you would say that, yeah, it's a land degradation, and yeah, it is as a desertification. So remember, always for monitoring, you need to look at the indicators. And there are basically 4 different techniques to do the monitoring, or to get the desertification into a temporal and spatial scale. Spatial scale, we mean over the area, over different places. And the temporal scale, it means over the time, the changes over the time. So we can use field monitoring, secondly, remote sensing, third, expert's opinion, and fourth, land user perspective. So let us start to know each one of these techniques, and let us start with the field monitoring. To do the field monitoring, you need human and you need instrument. So since basically it's in the field, so you go to the field with your instrument, and then you look at indicators, and then you would start collecting information about that indicator. For example, you can identify the climate factors like the temperature, like the rainfall, the solar radiation, and so on, using some of the instrument. For example, you can collect information about the rainfall variation and the rainfall intensity using rain gauge. Like you would see in these pictures here, you have weather station. You can collect about the temperature. You can collect about the solar radiation using the weather station. You can also get information about the soil compaction by using the bulk density sampler. You can also get an information about how fast the water moves inside the soil, and that would tell you whether water is actually going to be going into the soil or running over the surface. And if it's going on, and if it is running over the surface, then it will cause erosion, and you know what erosion can do when it comes to desertification. So to monitor the infiltration, or how fast the water moves into the soil, you use a double ring infiltrometer. And here you need the human also to collect the data and to stay in the field and monitor this one. You can also know, for example, about the vegetation density. And here you would bring a plot, and then you can calculate the number of plants and the density of this plant cover inside that block. And you can also know an information about the groundwater, the depth of groundwater, and then you can know whether this groundwater is now depleted or not. Or you can know the quality of the groundwater using the piezometer. So you would use these instruments with the help of an expert, a human, to stay in the field and collect the information. However, sometimes you can collect this information automatically. If you look at the weather station, it has a data logger. So it's a data logger is a system that actually store all the information in the memory. So you don't have to go every day into the field. Just, for example, go to the field once in a month or once in 6 months, and then you just download the information, and then you have to analyze them and to look at the data. Or sometimes even the technology allows that the weather station by itself can send the information to your computer, and then you will have to work it out and then use your experience to analyze this data and to extract the most important information that would tell you about desertification or the extent of desertification. So this is basically how the field monitoring can be done. Now you would ask yourself a question: is field monitoring the best method among the other 3 methods? Well, the answer to that, we have to look at the advantages and the disadvantages. Now, if we start just with the advantages, you would see that with the field monitoring, it's really a very precise one. Why? Because you would go to the field and you can monitor each one of the indicators using a specific instrument, and you will collect information, enough information with time about that particular indicator. So that's why it's one, precise, and then you collect various information about it. Secondly, since you use human, then you can quantify even the other sustainability pillars, not only the environmental impact, like monitoring the vegetation or the soil or the climate and so on, but you can monitor also and you can know the socio-economic features, for example, like the population, the movement of people, the living standard. And here you can do it by having the questionnaire. So, for example, you would go into the field and you would start distributing questionnaires or interviewing people and collecting information about this. You can also evaluate the public perception. Since you are going into the field, you can ask people, well, what do you know about this problem? Do you feel it's a problem? And then you can identify their perception, whether the people believe it's really a serious problem or just like a normal thing that happens in their daily life. And you can also discuss with them whether the solutions that you are thinking of might be or might work for them or not. And this would enhance the public acceptance, so it will tell you whether people would accept your solution or not. The only disadvantage with this method that since you use a lot of instruments, it's really costly. For example, I'll just give you a glance. Just if you look at that soil sampler for the bulk density, its price of an original instrument can reach up to 50 riyals. So imagine just that normal instrument is 50 riyals. Sometimes you can buy a sensor by, for example, 100 riyal. And we are using, for example, another instrument to scan the moisture content in the soil with the depth. And you know the price of that instrument? 3,000 Oman Riyal. So you would see one device only or one instrument can be really, really costly. But it's worth it sometimes. It's worth it because it gives you very precise information. Now let's move to the other technique. The other technique is remote sensing. And basically, the difference between field monitoring and remote sensing is very clear. Remote sensing is to collect information without being in the field or having a physical contact with the indicator. For example, you can collect information about the vegetation, distribution and intensity with time using the images that captured by the satellites for even like 60 years. You just sit in the computer, get those images, and then start analyzing and working them out. So this is one of the advantage of it. Like you can collect a lot of information without going into the field, without the need of so many instruments, because you would use the remote sensing instruments, like for example like the satellites or like the sensors which are hanged in plane or in a drone, and then you will collect this information of the reflection. The disadvantage, and you can cover of course a wide area, you can collect a lot of maps just like in a simple way. The disadvantage of this one, that basically when you do remote sensing, you are not exactly collecting information about the indicator. You are using a satellite, and this satellite, for example, sends waves, and then the reflected waves, you would analyze them. For example, if you are monitoring vegetation as an indicator using the satellites, then vegetation has a specific reflection. يعني كأنكم تقولوا بأنه الرفلكشن مال الفيجيتيشن تكون في هذا الويف لينث بس، مثل مثلا اما مثلا لما تكون التربه وحدها ما فيها فيجيتيشن، الويف لينث مالها كذا، الماي الويف لينث ماله كذا، فكل واحد منها الا ويف لينث معين. فانتم في الحقيقه ما مجمعين بيانات علات الفيجيتيشن مثل لما تروحوا في الفيلد ويعني تحسبوا الفيجيتيشن صح، يعني نفسها you are collecting information about the reflection. وبعدين عشان توجدوا يعني ال amount of the vegetation exactly the exact amount of the vegetation, you would have to do correlation. يعني لازم تسوي جرافات فيهن علاقة ما بين الويف لينث هذه وما بين الفيجيتيشن density الحقيقية. By this you have to go into the field, collect information about the vegetation, and then you can do the validation and verification, and then you would get these correlation graph, and then you can analyze the maps. To understand how remote sensing really work, we have to understand the types of sensors. So if you look at the picture here and you only look at the picture at the top, you would see that to do the remote sensing, you would need a sun, you would need a satellite with a sensor, and then you need to have the features or the indicators that you are trying to monitor using the satellites. For example, the vegetation. And then you need a ground station. So basically, here you have the satellites with the sensor, and you have the sun. The sun is the source of light, and the light goes into the land, into the vegetation, and so on. So what basically this sensor does in the satellite, it will only capture the reflected light or the reflected wavelength, and then it will record it, and then it will send it to the ground station where you have their computers, and then it can be analyzed, and so on and so on and so on. And this kind of system where the satellites only collect or record the information or record the wavelength emitted by the target is called a passive type sensors, because passive, it is not the source of light. It is basically only collecting the reflected information. So what is an active sensor satellite? If you look at the second picture, you would see that this sensor or this satellite now have a sensor that do two functions. Number one, it sends light. It's a source of light illumination. And secondly, it's a sensor that records the reflected or the emitted energy. So the sensor or the satellite with the sensor sends the energy and the lights subjected into the target feature, like the vegetation. Then there will be a reflected energy, and then it would be captured by the sensors of the satellite, stored, and then it sends to the ground station. And here you have two types of active sensors. You will have something called radar sensors, and basically radar sensors means it's a radio detection and ranging. يعني كلمة الرادار هذا اختصار لهذه الكلمة radio detection and ranging. وعندنا LiDAR اللي هي light detection and ranging. Of course, now I don't want you to memorize these sensors like the radar and the LiDAR, but I want you at least to know the difference between passive and active sensors. If we look at remote sensing, we would find it's a powerful technique, because it is actually used by different fields like the environmental field, engineering fields, hydrological fields, or soil fields, to do a lot of functions or to do a lot of things. And if we just concern about the application of remote sensing to monitor desertification, you would find that remote sensing can be used to monitor like wind erosion. You can also monitor the desertification due to salinity. And here, for example, an example is basically what is done in Al-Batani areas. You know that a lot of areas in Al-Batani area are undergoing this process of salinization and desertification due to salinity. So you can monitor that using remote sensing and collecting the maps and comparing them between, for example, 1970 all the days to 2020. You can also use remote sensing to monitor the overgrazing areas. And the application of this, for example, in Oman, you can do it in Salalah, where you have a vegetation that can be overgrazed over the time. So you can look at the vegetation pattern, whether it's recoverable, whether it is increasing or decreasing, and so on. You can also do a monitoring to the sedimentation. And if you want to look at this, you can, for example, link it to the situation that happens in the dams. So when the soil is eroded from the upstream, it will be actually settled in the downstream, for example, in the dams. And you know these sedimentations would affect the infiltration and many other things in that particular place. So you can monitor the amount of sediments and the extent of sedimentation using remote sensing. You can also do it to monitor the soil erosion due to water, like the gullies. And you can also do it to monitor the burnt areas, like what is happening in Australia. You can monitor the burnt forest in the areas there. And here is actually a map showing you the examples of monitoring aeolian desertification, which means it's desertification due to the wind erosion in China. So it's really. Now let's move to the other technique or method, which is basically based on the expert's opinion. So a fundamental question you might ask yourself here is, who is an expert? Well, an expert is basically a scientist in a specific field. For example, we have a soil science expert which has a specific background and knowledge about the soil and a specific field of soil, for example, soil physics or soil microbiology and so on. Or you might have another expert which is actually an environmentalist and he is specialized in the vegetation. So the expert has a specific knowledge in a specific field. And here actually the expert use his experience and knowledge to quantify the degree of desertification. For example, how the expert is being used as an assessment technique. So the expert goes into the field with his knowledge and experience, and then he would look at the indicator which has an experience on it. If he's a soil science expert, then he would look at the soil properties and the things that in the soil can tell you whether it's undergoing desertification or not. So he's using his perception and knowledge to quantify the degree of desertification. And this quantification is basically a qualitative. It's not a quantitative because he is not measuring something with an instrument. He is using his experience and knowledge to judge whether this area is undergoing desertification or not. And then he can link it to the degradation process, he can link it to the other sustainability factors like the productivity of the land, the biological functions, declination, and so on and so on and so on. So can we say this method is really a perfect method? Well, from the previous example that we described about in 80s, when they used experts' opinion to judge on the area, the Sahelian area, we saw that expert opinion was also criticized. Why? Because by its nature, it is a qualitative technique. It's a qualitative technique, and therefore it is subjected to errors. It's not something that has been measured by instrument, a very precise like the field. No, it's based on his qualitative assessment. And because of that, you can even find that if you bring this expert today into that land and you bring him tomorrow, the same person, to the same land, he might give you a different assessment because his knowledge and perception might change with time, and that's why it is not very precise technique. Move to the other technique, which is basically land user perspective. Now, land user perspective is a very important thing, and if we ignore it, we will miss a lot of information. Why? Because asking the people who live in that particular place would tell you exactly the real situation, and it will tell you whether the people perceive this as a problem or not, because they are the one who live over there. And therefore, if you ignore them, you might even end up with a suggesting something that would not tell you the exact problem, or people would not actually accept the solution. So that's why it should be really involved in this process. And when we talk about land user perspective, it involves all stakeholders. What we mean by all stakeholders? For example, you have the landowner, and you have the farmer itself, if the farmer is not the landowner, is not the owner of the land. And then you have also the local government there, and the government. So you will bring all of these stakeholders together in one place, like what you see here in the picture, like this one like a conference. And then you would talk to them, you would interview them, and you would tell them what you are suggesting as a solution for the problem. And then they will tell you what they feel and whether the solution is accepted or not. And then you can come up with a consensus. You can come up with an agreement that, okay, this is what they understood, and this is the solution that they would accept. So you would see that this kind of assessment based on land user perspective has a lot of advantages. Number one, you will get a realistic measurement based on the actual things that happening in the field, because you would ask the people who live over there. Secondly, this kind of assessment would integrate all the client or all the stakeholders. As I told you, you would bring all the people who are involved in that particular land. You will bring, for example, the farmer, you will bring the people in that village, you will bring the local government, and also the government. All of them would stay in the same place, and then you would talk to them, and then you come up with a conclusion that all of them agree with it. And the other and the very important thing, that the solution would be accepted, because you involve the people, you listen to them, and they feel that they are important and they can be even part of the solution, like what you see in the picture here, which is taken from Morocco. These are old people, and they actually perceived later on and become convinced that desertification is a problem, and to solve it they have to grow vegetation. So the government at this situation just distribute for them the trees, or themselves they can actually bring the trees and grow it. So when the people feel that it is important, they participate themselves into the solution. And the other thing, that since it's a bottom-top approach, it means that, as you can see from this picture of the brain, that you did not impose your ideology on them and ignore what they think, but you would ask people to suggest and so on, and therefore they will feel that you are listening to them, and they will feel that they are important, and therefore their acceptability will be very high. Now, I would give you an example of how the land user perspective is really very important. So we have here in Samail, for example, we have actually a very big wadi. Samail Wadi is really very big, and it can really create a lot of damages. So in 2007, like Gono happened, and then the amount of rain was very high, so the wadi becomes really very huge. And then what happens when the wadi flow? It usually disconnect the upper part and the bottom part of the wilaya. So we have the hospitals, the police stations, the schools, all of them or most of them exist in the upper part. So now the area downstream, منطقة السفالة, are disconnected. And not only that, so it's not only that, but the area also was flooded by the wadi. So later on they decided that okay, to solve this problem and this disconnection between the area, they will have to build a bridge that would actually allow the water to pass beyond the road, and then everything would be connected. So when they wanted to build this bridge, they actually did not talk to people, and they just come and they designed the pipes, they designed the bridge, and they did it. Next rainfall event, I don't remember, it was Fit or something. The wadi came, and the bridge they built, it was very small. So what happens? It actually the plant leaves مثل النخيل وما عرفمو, they actually blocked the wadi, and therefore all the wadi goes into the houses, and all the houses were flooded, the farms were destroyed, and so on. Here it gives you an indication that when they build it from a top-bottom approach without involving people, they missed a lot of information. But if they came down into the area and asked especially the old people, they will tell them that okay, we feel that what you are building is really very small because you don't know this wadi. We know it, we live here. And then they would tell them something realistic, and based on that they can suggest with them, and they can come up with a solution together. You know what happened next? Now when they involve people and ask them, they have to build a bigger bridge, and at that time they have to buy a lot of farms which are actually at the wadi. So when they came to people and asked them to sell them their lands, they did not explain to them the importance of this bridge, and they did not convince them. So some of them did not accept the idea of selling their lands. And then the government has to pay huge money to them, and even like they have like to do a law to make these people accepting the payment and selling their lands for this national project. But again, when you involve the people, when you come and ask them, listen to them, explain to them, they will feel the importance of the problem, and therefore they will participate. The disadvantage of this method is basically that it can be a bias. يعني ويش؟ يعني مثلا تروح عند شخص وتسأله تقول له مثلا كيف تحس بأن هل هذه الأرض يعني فيها مشكلة أو لا؟ فيجي يحكي لك على حسب الظروف اللي هو فيها، بيقول اوه كانت هذه الأرض في الأول تنتج والحين صارت ما تنتج، وليش؟ لأنه هو يعني حس بأنه هو ما قاس يستفيد. فيحاول مرات أن يعطي هذه المعلومات اللي هي مرات أن تكون خاطئة، على أساس أنه يعرف ممكن بأنه الحكومة قد تدفع له فلوس، قد تعوضه، قد تسوي شيء، تعطي أشياء بلاش وكذا، فيعطي معلومات خاطئة. من كذا يعني مرات أنها تكون bias. Therefore you have to be very careful to ask some of the questions which are indirect، لكنها في النهاية تخبرك المعلومة اللي أنت تريدها. That's why you have to be even careful when using this method. So that's all for this lecture. I hope that you enjoyed it. And the most important thing for you here is to understand the concept of monitoring and the differences between each technique, the advantages and the disadvantages. But you have to understand them again more than memorizing them. You have to understand them. And if you have any question, you can at the beginning tell your group members the amazing things, the most difficult things. Let your group members or friends try to explain to you. If you did not get it, you are most welcome to email me or discuss what we have taken in this lecture during the discussion time, inshallah. So I hope you a very nice day, and see you. Take care.